Hey there, and welcome to Drowsy History. Tonight, we're going to travel back to a place that felt very small and very frightened and very certain that the devil himself had come to live among ordinary people. We're going to a village in colonial Massachusetts in the year 1692 when the cold winter air carried whispers of witchcraft, and those whispers became accusations, and those accusations became something far darker and harder to stop than anyone had imagined. Before we ease into the story, I want to ask you something small. Wherever you are right now, whatever corner of the world you've settled into tonight, drop a gentle comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a quiet kind of comfort, picturing so many people scattered softly across the world, all drifting towards sleep together at different hours of the night. And if at any point your thoughts begin to slow, if your eyes feel heavy, if the words start to blur at the edges and lose their meaning, that's perfectly all right. That's exactly what this is for. There's no quiz at the end, no pressure to remember the dates or the names or the details. Just let the story move through you, soft and steady, like candlelight in a drafty room. So settle in. Pull whatever covers you have a little closer. Take one slow breath, and let's step gently back together to a place where fear was the most contagious thing in the world, and where ordinary life had become something almost impossible to navigate safely. This is Salem in the winter of 1692, and you wouldn't have survived a day of it. To understand why Salem happened, and why it spread so fast, and why it was so hard to stop, you first have to understand the world that produced it. Not just the geography or the politics, but the texture of daily life, the way the world felt from the inside when you were one of the people living it. Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1690s was a place under enormous pressure. It had been settled by Puritan colonists who had crossed the Atlantic carrying a very specific and deeply serious vision of what their community should be. They believed they had made a covenant with God, a deal. They would live righteously, they would honor the Sabbath, they would build a godly society in the wilderness of the New World, and in return, God would protect them and bless their efforts. But by 1692, that covenant felt like it was fracturing. The colony had recently lost its original charter. England had reorganized its colonial governments, and the Massachusetts colonists found themselves operating under new political rules they hadn't chosen and didn't fully trust. A new governor had arrived from England, Sir William Phips, and the legal framework of the colony was in genuine flux. Courts that had once operated with clear authority were suddenly operating in uncertain territory. On top of the political instability, there was the land itself. The wilderness of New England was not a tame or forgiving place. The forests pressed close around the villages, dark and seemingly endless, and they were genuinely dangerous. Relations between the colonists and the indigenous peoples of the region had deteriorated badly. King Philip's War, which had ended just over a decade earlier, had been one of the most devastating conflicts in colonial history relative to population size. Entire villages had been burned. People had been killed, captured, displaced. Many of the people who lived in Salem in 1692 had survived that war, or knew people who hadn't. The trauma of that violence hadn't gone anywhere. It lived in the community like something just beneath the surface, always close, always present. The forest at the edge of town wasn't just a forest, it was a place where terrible things had come from. And in the Puritan theological imagination, the wilderness was also something else entirely. It was the realm of the devil. Puritans took the devil very seriously, not as a metaphor, not as a symbol of abstract evil, but as a genuine, active, cunning, supernatural being who moved through the world seeking to corrupt and destroy God's people. He could appear to people in visions. He could send his servants, witches, to torment the innocent. He could afflict the body, cloud the mind, and spread misery through communities that had let their faith weaken or their vigilance slip. This wasn't fringe theology in 1692. This was mainstream, educated, deeply serious Puritan belief held by ministers, magistrates, doctors, and ordinary farmers alike. When something went wrong, when a child sickened without explanation, when livestock died strangely, when a neighbor behaved oddly, the possibility that the devil was involved wasn't a superstition to be dismissed. It was a live and terrifying possibility that demanded investigation. Into this already strained and frightened world, the winter of 1692 arrived, and in the household of Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem village, something began to go very, very wrong. Salem in 1692 was not one place but two, and that division matters enormously to understanding what happened. Salem town was the older, more established settlement, a busy, relatively prosperous port town with merchants and trade connections to the wider Atlantic world. Salem Village, a few miles inland, was something quite different. It was a farming community, smaller, poorer, more isolated, and caught in a long, grinding dispute with Salem town over everything from taxes to the right to have its own minister. The people of Salem Village were not a unified, peaceful community. They were a community with old grudges, property disputes, family feuds, and deep anxieties about their economic and political future. Some families had ties to the merchant economy of Salem town and were doing reasonably well. Others felt left behind, struggling to make their farms productive, watching the gap between themselves and their more prosperous neighbors widen. The minister at the center of it all was Samuel Parris, a man who had arrived in Salem Village in 1689 after a failed career as a merchant in Barbados. He was not universally loved. A significant portion of his congregation resented paying his salary and disputed his authority. His household included his wife Elizabeth, his daughter Betty, who was 9 years old, his niece Abigail Williams, who was 11, and an enslaved woman named Tituba, who had come with him from Barbados. The winter of 1691 into 1692 was long and cold and confining. The Puritan Sabbath and the rhythms of devout Puritan life didn't leave much room for entertainment or idleness, especially for children. And yet children found ways to fill the long hours. A small group of girls, including Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, and several others from neighboring households, had been gathering together, listening to Tituba tell stories, perhaps experimenting with folk magic of the kind that circulated informally, even in the most pious communities. Then Betty Parris began to behave strangely. She fell into fits. She threw herself around. She screamed. She complained that something was pinching her and biting her, though nothing visible was there. Soon, Abigail Williams showed the same symptoms, and then other girls in the village began to show them too. The adults around them watched in horror and growing alarm. The local doctor examined the girls and found no physical cause for their afflictions. He reached the conclusion that the village doctor of that era reached in such circumstances, the girls were bewitched. And with that word spoken aloud, the terrible machinery of the Salem witch trials began to move. The question that immediately followed the doctor's diagnosis was the one that would define the next several months. Who was doing this? Who had made a compact with the devil and sent their specter out to torment these girls? The pressure on the afflicted girls to name names was enormous, even if it wasn't always explicit. Ministers prayed over them. Adults asked leading questions. The community gathered around them and waited. And eventually, the names came. The first three people accused were Tituba, a local beggar woman named Sarah Good, and an elderly woman named Sarah Osborne. These were not random choices. They were women already on the margins of the community, an enslaved person of color, a woman living in poverty who rarely attended church, and a woman who had scandalized the village by living with a man before marrying him and had stopped attending services. In other words, they were people the community already viewed with some suspicion or disdain. When brought before the local magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, the three women were questioned publicly, with the afflicted girls present in the room. The questioning was not neutral. Hathorne, in particular, approached the interrogations as a prosecutor rather than an impartial investigator. He assumed guilt and worked backward from that assumption, pressing and demanding and interpreting every hesitation or inconsistency as evidence of the accused's guilt. Tituba, under what was almost certainly extreme duress and possibly physical coercion, confessed, and her confession was extraordinary. She described the devil in vivid detail. She said he had come to her and asked her to sign his book, that she had seen other names in the book too, that there were more witches operating in Salem village. That confession did two devastating things at once. First, it confirmed for the magistrates and the community that witchcraft was genuinely happening, not just suspected, but proven through confession. Second, it opened the door to more accusations. Tituba had said there were others. Now, everyone wanted to know who they were. Sarah Good maintained her innocence and in turn accused Sarah Osborne. Sarah Osborne also denied the charges. Both women were jailed, and the accusations kept coming. Within weeks, the circle of the accused had expanded dramatically. Names that once would have seemed impossible began to appear. Respectable church members, a former minister, a wealthy landowner's wife, a man who was a tavern keeper. The afflicted girls pointed and convulsed and screamed, and the community struggled to know what to do with the terror that was building in its midst. By late spring of 1692, the jails of Essex County were filling with the accused. The existing legal framework was genuinely uncertain. Remember, the colony was operating without its original charter, and a new court was assembled specifically to try the witchcraft cases. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which means simply to hear and determine, and it began sitting in June of 1692. If you had found yourself accused and brought before this court, you would have discovered very quickly that the rules of evidence operating inside it were unlike anything that would protect you today, and you would have been terrified. The most controversial form of evidence admitted was spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted that the specter or spirit of the accused had come to them in visions and dreams and tormented them. The idea rested on a theological assumption that the devil could only use a person's specter with their consent. Therefore, if someone's specter was seen tormenting others, that person must have consented, must have made a deal with the devil, and was therefore guilty. The problem with spectral evidence, as some ministers and thinkers noted even at the time, was that it was impossible to refute. You had no alibi for what your specter had done while your body was elsewhere. You couldn't cross examine a vision. You couldn't call witnesses who had been present during a dream. The afflicted girls could simply say they had seen you, that your shape had come to them, and there was nothing you could say that would definitively disprove it. Beyond spectral evidence, the court admitted physical tests that seem horrifying by modern standards. The accused might be subjected to the touch test, the theory being that touching the afflicted would draw the witchcraft back into the witch's body and cause the afflicted to stop convulsing. If the girls calmed when you touched them, that was taken as evidence against you. The accused were searched for witches' marks, unusual moles, birthmarks, or spots on the body thought to be where the devil's familiars had suckled. Almost everyone who was examined was found to have something that could be interpreted as suspicious. There was also the behavior of the afflicted themselves during the proceedings. When accused witches were brought into the courtroom, the girls would sometimes fall into dramatic fits, screaming, writhing, claiming to be pinched or bitten or stabbed by the accused's specter, even while the accused stood visibly still across the room. The court treated these fits as genuine supernatural events. Judges and observers who watched these performances were genuinely shaken and convinced. And then there were the confessions. Confession was the most damning evidence of all, and the pressure to confess was enormous and deeply perverse, because those who confessed were not executed. They were jailed and their cases held pending further investigation, with the expectation that they might help identify other witches. Those who maintained their innocence and refused to confess were convicted and hanged. The logic was brutal and inescapable. Confess to something you didn't do and live, or tell the truth and die. More than 50 people would eventually confess to witchcraft during the Salem crisis, almost certainly because they understood this terrible calculus and chose survival over truth. If you were accused during the Salem witch trials, the first thing that would happen to you before any trial, before any verdict, was that you would be arrested and jailed. The jails of Essex County in 1692 were not places designed for long-term confinement. They were crude, cold, dark, and overcrowded. The accused were held in facilities in Salem, Ipswich, Boston, and elsewhere, conditions varying but uniformly harsh by any standard. You would be shackled. Iron manacles and leg irons were considered standard for accused witches, based on the belief that physical restraint could limit a witch's ability to project her specter or do further harm. The weight of the iron was constant, cold in winter, chafing against skin day and night, making every movement slow and painful. The cells were dark, stone walls and earthen floors. Whatever light existed came through small, barred openings, barely enough to see by on the brightest days. In winter, the cold would seep through everything, through stone, through clothing, through whatever thin covering existed. In summer, the air grew close and fetid, the smell of unwashed bodies, illness, and human waste nearly unbearable in the confined space. Food was a problem. Prisoners were expected to pay for their own food and lodging while incarcerated. Yes, pay for the privilege of their own imprisonment. Those without family members who could bring food or funds faced genuine malnutrition on top of everything else. Some accused witches spent months in these conditions before their cases were resolved. The social and psychological dimensions of imprisonment were perhaps the cruelest part. To be accused of witchcraft was to be instantly transformed in the eyes of your community. People who had known you for decades, neighbors, fellow church members, people you had helped in times of trouble, now regarded you with fear and suspicion. The accusation itself was a kind of contamination. Families were torn apart. Husbands were separated from wives. Children were left without parents. In some cases, family members of the accused were themselves accused, the logic being that witchcraft could run in families. The nurse family, the proctor family, the carrier family, multiple members of the same household found themselves imprisoned together, facing the same terrible choices. At least 5 people died in jail during the Salem crisis without ever being tried. The elderly Sarah Osborne, one of the first 3 accused, died in Boston's jail in May of 1692. An infant died. The conditions of confinement were genuinely life-threatening, especially for the elderly and the very young. And through all of it, you would be maintaining your innocence, or deciding whether the cost of that innocence was too high to keep paying. Before we go further into the lives of the specific people who were accused and executed, let's stay for a while with something harder to name, something that lived in the air of Salem Village during those months, and that is very difficult to fully reconstruct from the outside looking in. That thing is the particular quality of the fear. Not just that people were afraid, of course they were afraid, but the specific texture of what that fear felt like when you were inside it, when it was yours. Imagine waking in the morning in your farmhouse in Salem Village in the summer of 1692. The fire needs to be coaxed from the coals. The children are stirring. There is the ordinary weight of the day ahead, the fields, the animals, the endless maintenance of a colonial household. And underneath all of that, there is something else, something you carry everywhere now, a low, steady alertness that never quite goes away. You know that people in your village are being arrested. Some of them you know well. Some of them you have worshipped beside for years. Some of them you had thought were as upright and devout as anyone you knew, and yet the accusations against them have been sworn to by multiple witnesses. The afflicted girls have fallen into fits at the mention of their names. The court has examined them and found them guilty. So what do you do with that? How do you hold the two things at once? Your knowledge of the accused as a person you trusted, and the institutional weight of the accusation against them. In most situations in life, when institutional authority and personal knowledge conflict, We have some framework for working through the tension. We can appeal to other institutions. We can find allies. We can wait for the situation to resolve itself one way or another. In Salem in 1692, the framework was broken. The institution doing the accusing was the court, backed by ministerial authority, backed by the theological certainty that witchcraft was real and that the afflicted girls were genuine witnesses to it. To question the court was to question God's own instrument of justice. To defend the accused too vigorously was to risk being suspected yourself. So people retreated into a careful, watchful silence. They tended their fields and fed their animals and sat in the meeting house on Sundays and said nothing that might attract the wrong kind of attention. They watched what they said and to whom they said it. They thought carefully before they signed any petition of support for the accused, and many who had initially been willing to sign withdrew their names when the social cost became clear. This watchfulness would have settled into the body, the slight tension in the shoulders, the way a conversation with a neighbor would have had a new, careful quality, a measuring of words that hadn't been there before, the way you might replay something you had said in passing and wonder whether it could be taken wrong, whether someone had noted it, whether it might find its way into an examination. Children absorbed this atmosphere from the adults around them. The girls at the center of the accusations were already inside a world that had taught them to see the devil's work in the unexplained and the frightening. But all the children of Salem village were learning something in 1692, learning that the world could turn, suddenly and without warning, on the people you thought you knew, learning that safety was more fragile than it had seemed. The long-term psychological effects on the survivors of Salem, both those who were accused and released, and those who had lived through the crisis without being touched by it directly, are difficult to measure but easy to imagine. Communities that have experienced that kind of rupture carry the scar of it for a long time. The distrust, the guilt, the shame, the careful navigating of relationships that had been broken and partly mended and never quite felt the same again. Night would have had a different quality in Salem in 1692. The darkness that settled over the village after sunset, complete and heavy in the pre-electric world, would have felt heavier than usual. The wind in the trees outside would have carried suggestions that it hadn't carried before. The sounds of the house settling in the cold, the movement of animals outside, the occasional cry of a child from the next room, all of it would have filtered through a layer of watchfulness that sleep might soften but never quite dissolved. You would have prayed. Of course you would have prayed. It was what you did. It was the framework inside which your entire inner life operated. You would have asked God for protection, for discernment, for the safety of your family. You would have tried to examine your own conscience for any sin that might have left you vulnerable to the devil's attention. You would have tried to trust that righteous living would keep you safe. It is worth pausing here, now that the first accusations have been made and the machinery of the court has begun to turn, and asking a question that seems simple on the surface, but is actually quite complicated underneath. How did the accusations spread? How did a crisis that began in the household of a minister, with a handful of young girls showing frightening symptoms, become something that would swallow an entire region? The answer has several layers, and none of them are simple. The first layer is the most obvious: the social dynamics of a small, close knit community where news traveled fast and where the lives of neighbors were genuinely, intimately entangled. Salem Village was not a place of strangers. These were people who had grown up together, married into each other's families, worked adjacent strips of farmland, worshipped in the same meeting house, argued over the same fences and water rights and unpaid debts for decades. When something happened in one household, it was known throughout the village within hours. When the afflicted girls began naming names, those names landed in a community that already had complex, charged relationships with the people they named. The second layer is the role of the examinations themselves. The public nature of the interrogations meant that every accusation was a community event. The afflicted girls sat in the room while the accused were questioned. Their fits and convulsions, dramatic, visible, impossible to ignore, provided constant reinforcement of the accusation's credibility. When the girls fell into agonies at the touch of the accused, or screamed that they could see the accused's specter in the room, the assembled crowd watched this happen and was moved by it. The examinations were not neutral fact finding exercises, they were performative events that generated their own emotional momentum. The third layer is the theological framework that organized what people saw. The Puritan ministers and magistrates who oversaw the proceedings were not ignorant men. They had read widely in the literature on witchcraft, the theological treatises, the legal precedents, the accounts of previous witch trials in Europe and New England. They had a well developed theoretical apparatus for understanding what they were witnessing. Within that apparatus, the girls' symptoms were explicable, the confessions were meaningful, and the spectral evidence was admissible. The framework didn't create the crisis, but it shaped the response to it in ways that made the crisis much harder to stop. The fourth layer, and perhaps the most uncomfortable, is the role of existing community tensions. Scholars who have analyzed the patterns of accusation in Salem have found that they were not random. The accusers and the accused tended to cluster along existing fault lines in the community. Families with property disputes, neighbors with old grudges, people on opposing sides of the long running conflict between Salem Village and Salem Town. The machinery of the witch trials gave people a mechanism to act on grievances that normal community life would have kept contained, and some people, not all, perhaps not most, but some, used that mechanism. The fifth layer is the most ordinary one. Fear is contagious, especially in close communities. Once the first accusations had been made, and the first examinations had been held, and the first confessions had been extracted, the crisis had a momentum of its own. People who were themselves frightened of being accused had an incentive to point elsewhere, to name someone else before someone named them. Confessing and naming others was the path to survival, and enough people took that path to generate a cascading series of accusations that spread outward like rings in water. By the time the crisis peaked in the summer of 1692, accusations had spread well beyond Salem Village to neighboring towns: Andover, Ipswich, Beverly, Gloucester. Andover actually produced more accusations than Salem Village by some counts, as the crisis jumped to new communities, and the same dynamics played out in new social landscapes. More than 200 people were accused across the region before it was over. 20 were killed. Hundreds more had their lives upended in ways that would take years or decades to recover from, if recovery was possible at all. One of the most striking things about the Salem witch trials, when you look at the full list of the accused, is how varied the people were. There was no single profile of a Salem witch suspect, and that unpredictability was itself a source of terror. In the beginning, the accused tended to fit recognizable stereotypes. They were women on the social margins, poor, elderly, difficult tempered, people who had already attracted suspicion or dislike from their neighbors. The accusation confirmed what people had already half suspected. It made a kind of horrible sense. But as the weeks passed and the accusations multiplied, the circle expanded in ways that defied easy explanation. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, a devout and respected church-going woman whose family was well established in the community. When her name was spoken as an accused witch, many in Salem Village were genuinely shocked. A petition was circulated in her defense, signed by 39 of her neighbors, a remarkable show of support in that climate of fear. It didn't save her. She was convicted and hanged. John Proctor was a prosperous farmer and tavern keeper, a man, and therefore outside the typical profile of witch suspects of the era, which skewed heavily female. He had been openly skeptical of the proceedings from early on, suggesting that the afflicted girls were simply lying and that a good beating would cure them of their fits. That skepticism was noted and resented. When his wife Elizabeth was accused, he was accused alongside her. He was convicted and hanged. She survived because she was pregnant, and the court chose not to execute a pregnant woman. Martha Corey was another full church member, an upstanding woman who had been openly doubtful about the accusations even before she herself was accused. Her doubt was taken as evidence. Her husband Giles, an elderly farmer in his 80s, initially cooperated with the proceedings and gave testimony that may have contributed to her arrest. He came to regret it deeply. When he was himself accused and brought to trial, he refused to enter a plea. This was a deliberate and devastating choice. Under English law at the time, a person who refused to plead could not be tried, but they could be subjected to a punishment called pressing, in which heavy stones were piled on the body to force a plea or cause death. Giles Corey was pressed to death over the course of 2 days in a field outside Salem town. He was 80 years old. He never entered a plea. His last words, according to tradition, were simply, "More weight." George Burroughs was perhaps the most extraordinary case of all. He was a Harvard-educated minister, the former pastor of Salem Village, a man of genuine education and standing. He was accused partly because of his spectral appearance and visions, and partly because of testimony about his unusual physical strength, which was taken as evidence of supernatural power. He was convicted and hanged, and at the gallows he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, which was widely believed at the time to be impossible for a witch, causing a visible stir in the crowd. The executions proceeded anyway. Children were accused. A 4-year-old girl named Dorcas Good, the daughter of the already accused Sarah Good, was arrested and imprisoned. She spent months in chains. The experience reportedly damaged her mind permanently. A dog was accused and executed. The terror had become something without logical edges. By the time the court was dissolved in October 1692, more than 200 people had been accused, 20 had been executed, 19 by hanging, and one, Giles Corey, pressed to death. Many more had languished in jail, and the question of how it had all happened, how ordinary communities and educated men and devout people had arrived at this place, would haunt New England for generations. While the trials proceeded through spring, summer, and into fall, life in Salem village still had to be lived. Animals still needed feeding, fields still needed tending, children still needed watching. The rhythms of colonial New England life did not stop for the crisis unfolding inside the meeting house and the courtroom. And this ongoing ordinariness, the fact that people were trying to live normal lives inside an extraordinary and terrifying situation, is one of the hardest things to fully imagine from this distance. A typical day in Salem Village in 1692 began early, very early. Before dawn, before first light, the household would stir awake. The fire needed coaxing from the banked coals of the night before. The animals, cattle, pigs, chickens, perhaps a horse, needed tending before anything else could happen. Water needed to be drawn. Food needed to be prepared. Breakfast was simple: porridge of cornmeal or rye, bread from the previous day's baking, perhaps a piece of salt pork or hard cheese. The family would eat together before the full work of the day began, and prayer was woven through every meal. Grace before eating, reflection after, the constant acknowledgement that God was watching and that the community existed in covenant with Him. The workday for a farming household was long and physically demanding. Planting, tending, harvesting, repairing fences, chopping wood, hauling water, caring for livestock, the labor was unrelenting and tied to the season's demands. Women's work ran alongside and intertwined with men's. Cooking, preserving, spinning, weaving, dipping candles, making soap, managing the dairy, raising children. Children worked too, from the time they were old enough to be useful. Small children tended chickens or gathered eggs. Older children helped with the dairy, carried water, minded younger siblings, and began learning the skills they would need to run households of their own. The Sabbath, Sunday, was the one break from physical labor, and it was not a day of leisure. The entire community was expected to attend a meeting, which was the Puritan equivalent of church service. Meeting could last for hours. The minister preached long sermons. The congregation sat on hard benches in an unheated building through the worst of the winter months. Children and elderly alike expected to maintain respectful attention through hours of theological instruction. The speed and reach of the crisis reflects something sobering about the conditions under which communities can turn on themselves. It didn't require extraordinary wickedness or extraordinary stupidity. It required a specific combination of existing tensions, genuine fear, an interpretive framework that gave the fear institutional legitimacy, and a social structure close enough that accusations could travel quickly and land with maximum force. Those conditions existed in Salem in 1692. They have existed elsewhere at other times, in other forms. They are not unique to the past. Daily life in Salem Village in 1692 was, by modern standards, physically demanding and nutritionally marginal. The diet of a colonial New England farming family was adequate in the broad strokes. They generally had enough to eat, but narrow and monotonous in ways that would strike us as stark. Corn was the staple: cornmeal porridge, cornbread, corn pudding. Corn in nearly every form appeared at nearly every meal. Rye was grown too, and a coarse, dense rye bread was common. Beans, dried and stored from the summer harvest, provided protein through the long winter months. Salt pork, pork preserved in brine, was the most common meat, eaten in small amounts as a flavoring for the endless pottages and stews, rather than in the generous portions we might associate with meat centered meals. Fresh vegetables were available seasonally. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips stored reasonably well, and gardens produced peas and cabbages and herbs in summer. But the winter and early spring months were the lean time, when the stores laid up in the fall were running down and the new growing season had not yet begun. This was the time when diets became most restricted, and when the body, already taxed by cold and labor, was operating on the thinnest margins. The winter of 1691 into 1692, the winter when Betty Paris first began showing her alarming symptoms, was exactly that lean and difficult time. The household of Samuel Paris, which was not wealthy, and which had a contentious relationship with the congregation that provided his salary, would not have been eating particularly well. The girls at the center of the crisis were spending long, cold, confined days in a household operating under strain. One theory about the origins of the afflicted girl's symptoms involves ergot, a fungus that can contaminate rye grain stored in damp conditions, and that, when consumed, can cause a range of alarming symptoms, including convulsions, hallucinations, a burning sensation in the limbs, and a sense of being tormented by invisible forces. The ergot theory has been debated and contested among historians for decades. It doesn't explain all of the evidence, and some scholars reject it entirely, but it points to something real: that the bodies of people living through a difficult winter in 1692 were not simply neutral vessels for their theological anxieties. They were bodies under physical strain, eating narrow diets, subject to the full range of the era's illnesses and deficiencies. The accused who were jailed experienced an even sharper version of nutritional deprivation. The jail diet was whatever could be afforded or brought by family members, often very little. Long months of confinement, poor nutrition, cold, and the physical stress of wearing iron manacles would have taken a visible toll. The people who emerged from the jails at the end of the crisis would not have looked like the people who had entered them. Missing the Sabbath meeting was noted. Behaving improperly during meeting was noted. The community watched itself carefully, and those observations found their way into people's assessments of their neighbors, forming the background texture of suspicion and judgment that made the witch trial accusations so easy for some people to believe. Against this backdrop of normal, demanding, exhausting, pious daily life, the fear of witchcraft moved like something slow and cold. You might be working in the fields when a neighbor's name was spoken, someone you had known for 20 years, and feel that cold certainty that nothing was safe anymore, that anyone might be an instrument of the devil, that the very ordinariness of daily life was no protection at all. There is a specific quality to the fear that operated in Salem in 1692 that is worth sitting with slowly because it explains so much about why the crisis unfolded the way it did. It wasn't the fear of something obviously monstrous or clearly foreign. It was the fear of the familiar made suddenly unknowable. The witch in Puritan theology wasn't a creature from the darkness outside the community. She was the neighbor you'd borrowed bread from last winter. She was the woman you'd sat beside in meeting for years. She was your sister. She was you. That inward turn of suspicion, the idea that evil could be not just nearby, but intimate, is one of the most psychologically destabilizing things a community can experience. Trust is the invisible architecture of daily life. When that architecture begins to crack, everything that depended on it becomes uncertain. People stopped speaking freely. Neighbors became cautious with each other. Friendships were re examined in light of new suspicions. Old grievances were revisited and reinterpreted. If so and so had been a witch all along, then what did that mean about that argument years ago? That strange illness? That dead cow? The inexplicable way the butter wouldn't come? The Salem crisis showed with brutal clarity what happens when a community's interpretive framework tells it that invisible malevolence is real and active and can wear any face. Every misfortune became potentially meaningful. Every unexplained illness, every dead animal, every run of bad luck became something to examine for signs of supernatural interference. But the evidence of the summer of 1692 was that righteous living was not a reliable protection, and that knowledge would have sat in the chest like a cold stone all through the long nights. One aspect of the Salem crisis that is easy to overlook when focusing on the dramatic center of accusations and trials is the role of the broader community, the people who were not accusers and not accused, but who lived through the crisis as witnesses. These were the majority of Salem Village's residents. They attended the public examinations. They sat in the meeting house and watched the afflicted girls perform their agonies. They heard the accused deny the charges. They signed or refused to sign petitions. They talked among themselves in the careful, measured way that the crisis had imposed on conversation. They watched their neighbors arrested and their community unravel, and they had to decide every day what their role in all of this was. Some of them believed, sincerely and completely, that witchcraft was happening and that the court was doing the necessary and painful work of rooting it out. These were not stupid people or cruel people. They were people whose worldview made the accusation credible and the prosecution righteous. Their belief was genuine. Their participation in the proceedings as witnesses or bystanders or supporters of the court came from that genuine belief. Others had doubts, but kept them quiet. The social cost of expressing skepticism in 1692, Salem was real and potentially severe. Thomas Brattle expressed his doubts in a private letter, not a public statement. Increase Mather's treatise against spectral evidence was published in October, after months of executions, not before. The people with doubts tended to voice those doubts carefully, in private to people they trusted, when the coast seemed clear, and some simply tried to keep their heads down and get through it. They had crops to tend and families to feed and the endless demands of colonial life to meet. The crisis in the meeting house and the courthouse was real and terrible, but so was the frost that could kill the winter wheat, and so was the fever that could carry off a child, and so were the 100 other mortal threats that ordinary life in 1692 Massachusetts already carried. People have a remarkable capacity to compartmentalize, to continue the ordinary rhythms of life alongside extraordinary catastrophe. The communal nature of Puritan life meant that no one could be truly separate from the crisis. The Sabbath meeting brought everyone together every week. The examinations were public. The executions were public. The whole community was, in a very real sense, an audience for the tragedy unfolding in its midst. And being an audience for an atrocity when you are not the one committing it, and when you believe the people committing it are operating from genuine religious conviction and legal authority, is one of the most morally complicated positions a person can occupy. The question of what you owe the victims, set against the question of what standing up for them might cost you and your family, does not have a clean answer. Most people, most of the time, do not stand up. This is a hard truth that Salem teaches with particular clarity. The community that watched would carry the weight of its watching long after the executions had stopped and the jailed had been released. In the years that followed, there were public acts of reckoning, the judge's confession, Ann Putnam's apology, the legislative compensation, but there were also all the private reckonings that never made it into the record. The conversations that happened in farmhouses and along fence lines, the moments when people who had stood by and said nothing looked at each other and tried to figure out what they had allowed to happen. Some of those people are your ancestors, if your family goes back far enough in New England. Some of them are the ancestors of people you pass on the street without knowing it. The community that watched Salem is not a distant thing. It is part of what made the country that eventually grew up around that small, frightened village on the edge of the Massachusetts forest. And into that framework, personal and community conflicts poured freely. Scholars studying the Salem records have noted that many of the accusations followed existing fault lines in the village, property disputes, long-standing family feuds, economic resentments, personal animosities. The machinery of the witch trials gave people a language and a mechanism to act on grievances that the normal structures of community life would have kept contained. None of this means that the accusers were simply cynical liars using the crisis for personal gain, though some probably were. Most of them were almost certainly operating in a state of genuine terror and genuine belief. The girls at the center of the accusations were young, impressionable, living inside a theological framework that made their symptoms completely explicable as supernatural attack. The adults around them were men and women of genuine faith who had devoted their lives to the belief system that made witchcraft not just possible, but expected. Fear, when it is genuine and shared and institutionally validated, has a tremendous power to override the cautions and the hesitations that might otherwise slow a community down. The tragedy of Salem is not the story of a few bad actors manipulating credulous fools. It is the story of an entire community overwhelmed by genuine terror, making terrible decisions inside a framework that gave those decisions the weight of divine necessity. The trial records of Salem are one of the extraordinary historical documents of early American life, not because they tell us about witchcraft, which did not exist, but because they preserve the voices of ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. Reading through the transcripts, you hear desperation and dignity and confusion and grief, and sometimes breathtaking courage. Rebecca Nurse, that elderly, respected woman who had been a pillar of her church community, pleaded her innocence from her first examination to her last breath. When the jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty in her case, one of the rare moments when the court's conclusions seemed to hesitate, the afflicted girls immediately erupted into fresh fits, and the judges sent the jury back to reconsider. They returned with a guilty verdict. At her sentencing, she was excommunicated from her church, a formal, devastating ceremony in which she was declared cut off from the community of God's people. Then she was taken to Gallows Hill and hanged. Her family, at great personal risk, retrieved her body in secret and buried her on their own land. John Proctor, from his jail cell, wrote a letter to several prominent Boston ministers that is remarkable for its clarity and moral force. He described the conditions of the interrogations. He described how suspects were tied in positions that caused physical pain until they confessed. He pleaded for the trials to be moved out of Salem, where the community passions had made a fair proceeding impossible. He asked with heartbreaking specificity for more time. The ministers to whom he wrote were sympathetic. Some of them were already having doubts about the proceedings, but they did not intervene in time to save him. Mary Easty, sister of the accused and executed Rebecca Nurse, knew when she wrote her final petition that it would not save her own life. She had been released once when the accuser's testimony against her faltered, then rearrested when the accusations resumed. She wrote to the court not on her own behalf, but on behalf of those who would come after her, asking the judges to examine more carefully the evidence and procedures they were using, so that future innocents might be spared. She was hanged shortly after. These voices, calm, lucid, dignified in the face of their own destruction, are what make the Salem records so difficult to read without something that feels very close to grief. These were real people. They had families and histories and interior lives, and they knew at the end exactly what was happening to them and exactly how little recourse they had. Not everyone in Massachusetts in 1692 was fully convinced that the proceedings in Salem were being conducted justly or wisely. There were doubters and dissenters, some of them quite prominent, and their story runs alongside the story of the trials themselves, like a counter melody. Cotton Mather was the most famous minister in Boston, educated, prolific, deeply invested in the question of witchcraft. He was a genuine believer in the reality of the devil's activities in New England, and he wrote extensively about the Salem trials in ways that lent them intellectual and theological credibility. He attended the execution of George Burroughs, and when the crowd seemed moved by Burroughs's flawless recitation of the Lord's Prayer, intervened to reaffirm the court's verdict. He is often cast as the villain of the Salem story, and there is justice in that casting. His support for spectral evidence and his endorsement of the proceedings carried real weight and did real damage. But his father, Increase Mather, president of Harvard and one of the most influential figures in colonial New England, was less comfortable with what he saw. In October 1692, he published a treatise called Cases of Conscience concerning evil spirits personating men, which argued carefully and theologically against the use of spectral evidence. His central point was simple and devastating. It was better, he wrote, that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. The treatise had influence. The court took notice. Thomas Brattle was a Boston merchant and scientist, a Fellow of the Royal Society, who wrote a remarkable private letter in October 1692 that circulated among the colony's educated class. He was scathing about the proceedings, pointing out the logical and evidentiary contradictions in the court's approach, questioning the reliability of the afflicted girl's testimony, and noting with dry precision that many of the confessions had been extracted under conditions that made them worthless as evidence of guilt. Robert Califf, a Boston cloth merchant, spent years after the crisis collecting testimony and writing a critical history of the trials, a project that earned him the fury of Cotton Mather, but survived to become one of the most important early accounts of what had happened. The doubters did not stop the trials in time to save the 20 people who died, but their voices increase Mather's careful theological argument, Brattle's sharp rational critique, the petitions of the accused's families, the quiet resistance of jurors who later recanted their verdicts in shame, were what ultimately pushed the governor to dissolve the court and end the prosecutions. By October 1692, the court of Oyer and Terminer was disbanded. The remaining accused were eventually released. The crisis, at last, was over. The body under that kind of sustained strain does strange things. Sleep becomes fragmented and unrefreshing. The mind grows slow and prone to dark thoughts. Small physical discomforts that a well-fed, well-rested person might dismiss become significant sources of misery. The constant low-level hunger and the weight of the chains and the cold of the cell, all of it compounding week after week until the will to maintain and defend one's innocence was worn thinner than it might otherwise have been. It is worth holding that physical reality in mind when thinking about the confessions. More than 50 people confessed to witchcraft during the Salem crisis. Each of those confessions has traditionally been analyzed in terms of its social and theological context, the social pressure to confess, the theological framework that made confession intelligible. But each of those confessions was also made by a body that was cold and hungry and shackled and hadn't slept properly in weeks, a body that had reached the outer limits of what it could sustain. The people who confessed were not weak or faithless. They were human, and the conditions under which they were held were designed, whether intentionally or not, to make maintaining any position, let alone a position of principled refusal, extraordinarily difficult. Every Sunday, throughout the Salem crisis, the community gathered in the meeting house and the minister preached. This was not optional. Sabbath attendance was a community obligation enforced by social pressure and in earlier years, by law. The sermon was the central intellectual and spiritual event of the week for most Puritan communities, the moment when the theological framework that organized daily life was articulated, reinforced, and applied to current circumstances. Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village, whose household was at the center of the crisis, preached through the entire crisis. His sermons from this period have been preserved, and they are remarkable documents of a man who had convinced himself that his community was under direct satanic assault and that the response was righteous war. His sermon themes drew heavily on images of conflict: Christ versus Satan, the saved versus the damned, the church community besieged by enemies from without and within. He used the parable of Judas repeatedly, the disciple who had seemed to be part of the community, but was in fact a betrayer. The implication was clear. There were Judases in Salem village, people who appeared to be members of the congregation, but who had secretly given their loyalty to the devil. The effect of hearing that message, week after week, from the pulpit of your own church, in the voice of your minister who had spiritual authority over your community, the effect of that on a congregation already frightened and already watching their neighbors with new suspicion is not difficult to imagine. Every sermon reinforced the framework. Every sermon told the congregation that the crisis was real, that the enemy was among them, and that identifying and rooting out that enemy was a spiritual obligation. Other ministers in the region preached similar themes, though with varying degrees of urgency. Cotton Mather was perhaps the most eloquent and the most fervent in his support for the proceedings. His published accounts of the Salem crisis, particularly Wonders of the Invisible World, published in the fall of 1692, provided intellectual and literary legitimacy for the court's actions and were read throughout the colony. But there were also ministers who were quieter, who asked careful questions in private, who worried about the spectral evidence and the fairness of the proceedings, even when they did not say so publicly. The ministerial community of Massachusetts was not uniformly in support of the court's methods, even if most of its members did not publicly challenge those methods while the executions were happening. The power of institutional religious authority in Puritan New England cannot be overstated when thinking about why the crisis was so hard to stop. The ministers were the intellectual and spiritual leaders of their communities, educated, respected, authoritative. When they endorsed the proceedings, the community endorsed them. When they hesitated or expressed doubt, it created permission for others to hesitate and doubt. The eventual shift in ministerial opinion, led by Increase Mather's October treatise against spectral evidence, was a significant factor in the dissolution of the court. What the people of Salem heard from the pulpit shaped what they thought was happening and what they believed was right to do about it. The sermon was not separate from the crisis. It was part of the mechanism by which the crisis sustained itself, and eventually part of the mechanism by which it ended. Between June and September of 1692, 19 people were hanged on a rocky hillside outside Salem town, in a place that came to be known as Gallows Hill. Each execution was a public event. The community gathered to witness, to take note, to draw whatever meaning they could from what they saw. The condemned were transported to the hill by cart, hands bound, surrounded by officials and observers. The route passed through the town, past houses and neighbors, and the ordinary geography of the lives they had lived. Ministers offered prayers. The accused were given the chance to speak. Almost all of them maintained their innocence to the end. This was remarkable and noted. In most execution settings of the era, the condemned were expected to confess their crimes and express contrition as part of a ritual of public moral resolution. The refusal of the Salem condemned to follow that script, to stand at the foot of the gallows and insist again that they were innocent of the charges against them, created a visible tension at every hanging. The first to be executed was Bridget Bishop on June 10th. She was not one of the original accused. She had been examined and released during an earlier period of accusations years before, and she had a reputation in the community as a somewhat unconventional woman. She maintained her innocence. She was hanged. On July 19th, 5 people were hanged together: Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds. Sarah Good, still declaring her innocence, is said to have shouted to the minister at the gallows that he was a liar, that if he took her life, God would give him blood to drink. The minister, Nicholas Noyes, would die years later of an internal hemorrhage. 5 more were hanged on August 19th, including the Reverend George Burroughs. 8 were hanged on September 22nd in what would be the last mass execution of the crisis. Giles Corey was pressed to death on September 19th. 2 dogs were executed as suspected familiars. The bodies of the executed were not treated with the respect normally accorded to the dead. They were buried in shallow graves on the hill itself, or in some cases dumped in rock crevices. The families of the executed were often denied the right to a proper burial. It was part of the logic of the accusation. These were witches, servants of the devil, and did not deserve the rites of Christian burial that would see them decently into the ground. Several families, as with Rebecca Nurse's family, retrieved their loved ones secretly and buried them on their own land. The act of doing so carried some risk. It could have been interpreted as itself a suspicious act, a sign of sympathy with the convicted. But they did it anyway. The hill where the executions took place remained known but unmarked for centuries. Its exact location was uncertain and disputed for a long time. Even the geography of the event had been half buried by time and shame. It was not until 2017 that the city of Salem officially recognized the likely location of the executions. A memorial now marks the site. The Salem witch trials ended not with a dramatic confrontation or a sudden revelation of fraud, but with a gradual, quiet shift in the colony's collective willingness to continue. By the fall of 1692, the accusations had grown so expansive, touching people of high social standing, including the governor's own wife, that the machinery of prosecution had begun to undermine itself. Governor Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692. A new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was convened early in 1693 to try the remaining cases, but it operated under very different rules, refusing to admit spectral evidence. Of the remaining cases tried under those rules, all ended in acquittals. Eventually, the governor pardoned all those still held in jail, and the crisis was formally over. But the ending brought its own kind of difficulty, because what came after the crisis was the need to live with what had happened. The community of Salem Village, now officially renamed Danvers, as if the change of name might help, had to figure out how to go on. Neighbors who had accused each other faced each other across fences and church pews. Families who had lost members to the gallows had to find a way to share a community with people who had testified against those members. The reckoning was slow and uneven. In 1697, Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the sitting judges of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, made a public confession of his guilt and responsibility during a church service, standing silently while a statement of regret was read on his behalf. He spent the rest of his life fasting annually on the anniversary of the executions in penitence. He was the only judge to make such a public acknowledgment. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the central accusers among the afflicted girls, made a public confession before her church. She expressed regret for her role in the deaths of innocent people and attributed her actions not to malice, but to a great delusion of Satan. It is impossible to know what she truly understood or felt. The statement was formal and structured, written for her and delivered in the religious language of the time, but it was, among the accusers, almost singular. The Massachusetts legislature eventually passed legislation in 1711 restoring the rights and reputations of many of the convicted and awarding compensation to survivors and the families of those executed. The amounts were modest, the names were, one by one, being cleared, though not all of them were formally exonerated for centuries. Elizabeth Johnson, Jr., convicted of witchcraft in 1693, was not officially exonerated by the Massachusetts legislature until 2022, 329 years after her conviction. The long, slow work of reckoning with Salem has never fully ended. The memorials and the apologies and the legislation and the scholarly analysis have accumulated over the centuries. But the basic fact remains: 20 people were killed by their own community. Hundreds more were imprisoned, impoverished, and traumatized. The families of the executed carried the grief and the stigma for generations. The children of Salem Village in 1692 were witnesses to something they would carry for the rest of their lives. Not just the dramatic center of the crisis, the fits, the examinations, the executions, but the slower, quieter damage that a community in crisis does to the people growing up inside it. Childhood in Puritan New England was not a protected or particularly gentle thing by modern standards. Children were small adults in many respects, expected to work from the time they were physically capable of it, expected to sit through the same long Sabbath sermons as their parents, expected to understand and internalize the theological framework of sin and salvation that governed every aspect of life. Puritan theology had a specific and quite vivid understanding of the spiritual danger facing children. The doctrine of original sin meant that every child was born already in a state of sinfulness, already at birth in need of grace and redemption. The catechism that children learned from their earliest years emphasized the reality of hell, the certainty of God's judgment, the constant need for vigilance against sin. This was not experienced by Puritan children as cruelty. It was simply the truth as their community understood it. But it meant that children grew up with a very particular interior landscape, one in which spiritual danger was as real as physical danger, in which the devil was as present a threat as cold or hunger or disease, in which the invisible world was as vivid and consequential as the visible one. Against that backdrop, the events of 1692 would have had a particular power. The afflicted girls were children and young adolescents. Betty Paris was 9. Abigail Williams was 11. Many of the other afflicted accusers were teenagers. They were at ages when the world is especially vivid and impressionable, when the line between imagination and perception is still relatively fluid, when the frameworks adults provide for understanding experience carry enormous weight. What they experienced, whether it was genuine psychosomatic illness, or conversion disorder, or deliberate performance, or some combination, was real to them in the way that matters most. It was real in its effects. It shaped what happened next. And what happened next shaped everything. The children who were not at the center of the crisis also absorbed what was happening around them. They watched adults they trusted behave with fear and urgency. They heard names spoken in whispers. They saw neighbors arrested. They attended the same public examinations their parents attended. They learned, in the most direct possible way, that the world was dangerous and that the danger could come from inside the community, from the person standing next to you in meeting, from the woman who had helped with the harvest last fall. Some of the children of Salem Village grew up to become the adults who eventually pushed for the formal reckoning with what had happened. Ann Putnam Jr., who was 12 when she was a central accuser, was 32 when she made her public confession in 1706. What those 20 years had been like for her, what it had meant to grow up as one of the people whose accusations had sent others to their deaths, is something we cannot know. The confession is the only window we have into her inner life, and it is a narrow one. Dorcas Good was 4 years old when she was arrested. She spent months in chains. Whatever her life was after that, it began with that imprisonment, with the knowledge, absorbed into the body and mind of a 4-year-old, that the world could do that to a child. The children of Salem are perhaps the clearest evidence of what the trials really were, beneath all the theology and the legal procedure and the spectral evidence debates. They were a catastrophe that fell hardest on the most vulnerable people, the elderly, the poor, the socially marginal, and the very young, and that left its marks on everyone it touched. So let's return to the question at the heart of tonight's story. If you had been living in Salem Village in 1692, why wouldn't you have survived? The honest answer is that your survival would have depended almost entirely on things you couldn't control: your social position, your family connections, your personal enemies, your gender, and a great deal of luck. If you were a woman, and especially if you were a woman who had ever attracted the slightest suspicion from your neighbors, your risk was substantial. Women accounted for the majority of the accused, and the profile of a witch suspect in the Puritan imagination mapped neatly onto the kinds of women who already occupied uncertain social positions: older women, widows, women without male protectors, women who were outspoken or contentious, women who had made enemies. If you had a long-standing property dispute with any family connected to the accusations, your risk went up considerably. If you had ever spoken dismissively about the afflicted girls or their symptoms, your risk went up. If you had failed to attend meeting regularly or had any mark on your reputation for piety, your risk went up. If you had already been suspected of witchcraft in an earlier period, there had been witch accusations in New England before 1692, your name was already in people's minds. But the truly frightening thing about Salem is that social respectability and upright behavior and devout religious practice were not reliable protection either. Rebecca Nurse was all of those things. George Burroughs was a Harvard educated minister. Martha Corey was a full church member in good standing. The circle of accusation had shown by late summer of 1692 that it could expand to include almost anyone. If you were accused, you would face a choice so terrible that even describing it at a distance feels cruel. You could maintain your innocence, knowing it was the truth, knowing that God knew it was the truth, and likely be convicted and hanged. Or you could confess to something you did not do, name other people who were also innocent, and survive in prison until the crisis ended. Those who chose confession did survive in significantly greater numbers than those who refused to confess. The math of it is bleak, but confession meant living with what you had done, the names you had given, the people you had implicated, the lie you had told in a community that believed the lie absolutely and would hold you to it. You might survive the trials. You might eventually walk out of that dark, cold jail into the pale light of a Massachusetts morning and find your way back to whatever remained of your life. But you would carry Salem with you. The whole community would carry it for years and decades, and in some ways, forever. The Salem witch trials unfolded across the full arc of a New England year, and the natural world moved through its own rhythms alongside the human catastrophe taking place within it. The first accusations came in the deep cold of late winter, January and February of 1692. This was the hardest time of year in colonial New England. The stores laid up in fall were running down. The cold was at its most relentless. There was little to do outdoors, and too much time to spend indoors in small, smoky spaces with the same few people, the same limited range of concerns, the same walls pressing close. The examinations of the first accused took place in March as the cold was beginning, barely beginning, to relent. The prison population began to grow through April and May as accusations multiplied. Outdoors, the world was coming back to life in the slow, tentative way of New England spring. The first green pushing through the mud, the trees beginning to leaf out, the days stretching longer. The countryside was becoming navigable again after the winter confinement. The Court of Oyer and Terminer sat for the first time in June. The first execution was June 10th. Summer, the growing season, the most active and outward-facing time of year in a farming community, was when the executions peaked. The July hanging of 5 people, the August hanging of 5 more. The work of the fields went on around all of it because it had to go on. The corn and the rye and the wheat didn't wait for the crisis to resolve itself. The last mass execution was September 22nd, 8 people in a single morning. By that point, the harvest would have been underway or approaching, the grain standing heavy and gold in the fields, the days beginning to shorten, the first hints of the cold to come moving through the evenings. The village was bringing in the harvest and hanging its neighbors at the same time. October brought the dissolution of the court and the cessation of the executions. The leaves were turning in the Massachusetts forest, that extraordinary annual transformation of the landscape that New England is famous for, the reds and oranges and yellows blazing from every hillside before the trees went bare. The world was preparing for winter again. The crisis, at last, was winding down. There is something quietly terrible about the way the natural world simply continued through all of it. The cold came and went. The green returned and departed. The sun rose and set on the examinations and the executions and the jails full of shackled innocents. Nature is indifferent to human catastrophe in a way that can feel either comforting or brutal depending on how you hold it. For the survivors of Salem, the ones who had been jailed and released, the families of the executed, the community that had watched and said too little and too late, the turning of the seasons after 1692 must have had a particular quality. The first winter after the crisis, the first spring, the return to the fields for the planting, all the ordinary rhythms of life resuming in a community that was trying slowly and painfully to figure out how to be a community again. The land itself was unchanged, the same rocky soil, the same dark forest at the edge of the cleared fields, the same sky overhead. The human world layered over it had been shaken to its foundations and was trying to reassemble itself. Those two things, the indifferent permanence of the natural world and the fragility of the human community within it, existed alongside each other in Salem after 1692, the same way they exist alongside each other everywhere, all the time, if you are willing to look at them both at once. Let's slow down for a while and step back from the drama of the courts and the executions and the theological arguments and simply imagine what it was like to move through the physical world of Salem Village in 1692. The textures and sounds and smells of daily life that formed the backdrop to everything else. Your house, if you were a typical farming family in Salem Village, would have been a modest frame structure, a central chimney with fireplaces on multiple sides, small windows covered in oiled paper or thin wooden shutters rather than glass, low ceilings, heavy timber framing, and wooden floors that creaked with every step. The main room would have served as kitchen, dining room, and gathering space. Upstairs, under the steep roof, would have been the sleeping chambers, dark, often cold, shared without much privacy. The hearth was the center of everything. It was where food was cooked, in iron pots hung over the fire, in a brick oven built into the chimney side for bread baking days. It was where the family gathered in the evening for whatever small warmth and light the fire provided. It was where laundry was heated and soap was made and candles were dipped. The fire was never let out completely if it could be helped. Banking the coals at night meant a faster start in the morning, and starting a fire from nothing in a New England winter morning was a serious undertaking. The smell of the house would have been something we would find startling today. Wood smoke always, soaked into everything, the walls, the clothing, the hair, the smell of whatever was cooking, which in winter was often something slow and salt heavy, the smell of the animals that might shelter in an attached shed or just outside the door, the smell of bodies that were washed infrequently and clothed in wool that held odor through long weeks of hard labor. Outside, the village itself was compact and close-knit in a way that modern suburban or rural life rarely is. Houses were within shouting distance of each other. People could hear their neighbors through the walls on cold nights when the air was still. The roads between houses were unpaved, muddy in spring and fall, frozen in winter, dusty in summer. The meeting house stood at the center of the community's life, a plain, unadorned building without the decorative features of an Anglican church, because the Puritans believed that ornamentation was vanity and distraction. It was where the community gathered every Sunday and for special occasions. It was also, during the crisis, where the examinations of the accused took place, where the afflicted girls sat and suffered and pointed, and where the accused stood and denied and were not believed. Beyond the village, the forest, always the forest, dark and enormous and pressing close, full of things the colonists feared, real dangers and imagined ones, animals and enemies, and the devil's own wilderness. Children were warned away from it. Adults moved through it with purposeful caution. At night, from the edge of the village, you could look out into that darkness and see nothing at all, just the vast, complete blackness of a world without artificial light, pressing up against the narrow circle of the community's candles and hearth fires. That darkness was very real, and in 1692 it felt very full. To understand Salem, really understand it, in the full weight of what it meant, you have to sit with the theology for a while, not dismiss it as superstition and move on, but actually inhabit it for a moment, the way the people of Salem inhabited it. Puritan theology in 1692 was not a simple or unsophisticated system. The ministers of New England were educated men, most of them Harvard graduates, steeped in a long tradition of careful biblical interpretation and theological argument. They had worked through their understanding of God, the devil, salvation, and damnation with real intellectual rigor. When they said they believed the devil was active in the world, they meant it in a considered, informed way, not in the way a frightened child believes in monsters under the bed. The world they described was one in which the invisible and the visible existed in constant, urgent relationship. God watched every moment of every day. He noted every sin, every omission, every failure of faith or obedience. The community's collective relationship with God was real and consequential. If the community sinned, God might withdraw his protection and allow affliction to come upon them. The witch trials weren't just a criminal proceeding, they were a spiritual emergency requiring collective action. This framework meant that individual suffering was never simply individual. When your child sickened, it raised questions about your household's spiritual state. When your crops failed, the communities did it as a sign. When the afflicted girls began convulsing, the question wasn't just what was wrong with them medically. The question was what it meant for the whole community that the devil had come among them. Living inside that framework must have been both sustaining and exhausting. Sustaining because it gave meaning to everything. Nothing was random. Nothing was outside God's purpose. Everything that happened was part of a larger story. Exhausting because it meant that every moment of every day carried spiritual weight, that rest and ease were always shadowed by the awareness of God's watchful gaze and the community's collective accountability. The afflicted girls were not operating outside this framework. They were deeply inside it. They were children who had grown up in households where the devil's reality was as certain as the reality of the cold. When they began experiencing symptoms, when the visions and the fits came, it was entirely natural, within their worldview, to interpret those experiences as supernatural attack. They may well have believed, genuinely and completely in what they were experiencing. Historians and psychologists have proposed many explanations for the afflicted girl's symptoms over the years: conversion disorder, ergot poisoning from fungus contaminated grain, deliberate performance, communal hysteria, a combination of all of these. No single explanation has fully satisfied the historical debate. What we can say with confidence is that the girls' experiences were real to them and real to the community around them, and that reality, not any cynical manipulation, is what made the crisis so hard to stop. Salem did not end in 1692. It echoed forward through the centuries, through the literature and law and culture of America, becoming one of the most referenced moments in the national story, a shorthand for mob mentality and institutional failure and the terrible consequences of fear allowed to run without check. Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible in 1953 as an allegory for the McCarthyite anti communist hearings that were destroying careers and lives in mid 20th century America. The parallel was not difficult to see: a community gripped by fear of an invisible enemy, accusations spreading faster than evidence, the pressure to name names, the terrible choice between capitulation and destruction. The Crucible became one of the most performed plays in American theater history, and its central images, the accused standing before their accusers, the afflicted pointing, the question of who will break and who will stand, have entered the culture so deeply that people invoke them without always knowing they come from Salem. Legal scholars have cited Salem as an early and terrible example of the need for procedural protections in criminal law: the right to confront your accusers, the inadmissibility of evidence that cannot be tested and disproven, the presumption of innocence. The spectral evidence debate of 1692 maps, in uncomfortable ways, onto debates about evidence and proof and the standards of justice that have continued in American law for 3.5 centuries. Salem itself, the city that grew from the town, has lived with its history in complicated ways. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the city tried to quietly minimize its association with the trials. Then, in the latter part of the 20th century, the balance shifted and Salem became a destination, a place where tourists come for the history, the Halloween atmosphere, the witch museums, and the memorial sites, and the feeling of standing in a place where something terrible and consequential happened. Let's come back one last time to the night, to the specific experience of trying to sleep in Salem Village during the months when the crisis was at its worst. The Puritan understanding of sleep was not simply a practical matter. Sleep occupied a specific place in the theological imagination of the era. It was the time when the rational, watchful mind relaxed its control, when the soul was, in a sense, most vulnerable to visitation, whether from God or from the devil. Dreams were taken seriously as potential channels of divine communication or demonic influence. The night in Puritan experience was not simply a period of physical rest, but a theologically charged space. The afflicted girls had reported that their spectral tormentors came to them in dreams and visions, that the shapes of the accused appeared to them in the night, pinching and biting and pressing upon them. This was the origin of spectral evidence. The night visions of the afflicted, reported as real occurrences, treated by the court as genuine supernatural events. For the ordinary residents of Salem village who had not been touched directly by the accusations, sleep in the summer and fall of 1692 would have been shadowed by that knowledge. The night was the time when the devil sent his agents. The night was when the specters moved, lying in the dark in your farmhouse, with the sounds of the house settling around you and the breathing of your family close. You would have known that this was the time when the witches were said to do their work. The Puritan practice of prayer was the recommended antidote to these nighttime fears. Evening prayers, family prayers, the commendation of the household to God's protection before sleep. These were not merely ritual, but genuine acts of spiritual self-defense in a world where supernatural threat was taken seriously. You would have prayed with real urgency. The words would not have been routine, and yet sleep came because it had to. The body's needs are not overridden by fear indefinitely. The long physical labor of the farming day would have pulled even the most anxious mind down into unconsciousness eventually. But the sleep would have been light, fitful, easily broken. The kind of sleep that leaves you more tired in the morning than you were when you lay down. People in Salem who were accused and jailed would have experienced a very different quality of sleep, if sleep came at all. The cold stone, the weight of the chains, the sounds of other prisoners nearby, the absolute darkness of a cell with no fire and no light. The physical discomfort alone would have made sustained sleep nearly impossible, and underneath the physical was the weight of the situation itself, the accusation, the trial coming, the terrible choice between confession and continued innocence. Some of the accused were held for months before their cases were resolved, months of those conditions, months of that quality of sleep or the absence of it. By the time they faced the court, they would have been physically depleted in ways that compounded everything else. The hunger, the cold, the isolation, the weight of the iron. The ones who were acquitted and eventually released walked out of those conditions into a world that had continued without them. The seasons had turned. Their farms had been managed by others, or not managed at all. Some had lost property, livestock, income during their imprisonment. The law that required prisoners to pay for their own confinement meant that many emerged from jail in debt, as well as in poor health. The first night back in their own beds, in their own homes, by their own fires, must have had a quality that is difficult to imagine from the outside. The familiar smell of home, the weight of a known blanket, the breathing of family members close by, the absence of chains, the presence of the ordinary world in all its warm, specific, irreplaceable texture. And perhaps, in that familiar darkness, with the fire burned low and the household sleeping around them, and the night outside as quiet as it had ever been, perhaps sleep came then, slowly and heavily, as the body finally allowed itself to release what it had been holding for all those cold, frightened months. We like to imagine that rest like that is restorative, that enough of it can heal what was broken. Maybe sometimes it can. Maybe the ordinary rhythms of life, the morning fire, the animals to tend, the fields to walk, the food to prepare, the prayers to say, the darkness to sleep through. Maybe those rhythms do carry people back towards something like wholeness, eventually, if they are given enough time. The survivors of Salem were given time. Most of them lived out relatively normal lives after the crisis ended. They farmed and worshipped and raised children and grew old in the same village where the terrible thing had happened. Whether the ordinary rhythms healed them or simply covered what remained, that is something the historical record cannot tell us. But the fact that they stayed, that they rebuilt the routines of daily life in the same place and among the same people, suggests something about the human capacity to continue. To wake up in the morning when the cold requires it, to tend the fire, to do the work, to lie down again when the light fails, to do it again. That capacity for continuation, for the steady maintenance of daily life in the face of what life sometimes demands, that is one of the quieter things Salem teaches. Not a grand lesson about justice or fear or institutional failure, though it teaches those things too. Just the smaller, more human lesson that ordinary life is more durable than catastrophe, and that sleep comes eventually, even in the darkest places. The Peabody Essex Museum in Salem holds the original court documents from the trials, the examination transcripts, the petitions, the confessions, the indictments, thousands of pages of primary source material in which the voices of the accused and the accusers are preserved with remarkable clarity. To read those documents is to feel the proximity of 1692 in a way that is genuinely startling. These are not remote or abstract people. They are people who sound, in their grief and their fear and their occasional dry skepticism, remarkably human. The memorial in Salem, dedicated in 1992, the tercentenary of the trials, is a simple and powerful space. Stone benches line the perimeter, each one inscribed with the name of one of the executed. The entrance is partially blocked by a low stone threshold, and embedded in the ground at the entrance are fragments of the protests of the accused, phrases from their petitions and testimony, words they spoke in their own defense, cut off mid-sentence by the encroaching stone. The design enacts the experience of being cut off, of being silenced, of having your words run up against a wall. There is a specific quality of stillness in that place, the kind of stillness that comes from standing somewhere that holds real weight. The memorialization of Salem has itself been a decades-long process of negotiation between different communities with different stakes in the story. The descendants of the accused have organized, petitioned, and advocated for formal recognition of their ancestors' innocence over many years. The descendants of the accusers have sometimes participated in those efforts and sometimes maintained a distance from them. The city of Salem has had to navigate its relationship with a history that is simultaneously its most famous attribute and one of its deepest sources of shame. The witch trials have also been the subject of extensive scholarly debate about causes and interpretations that is never fully settled. Was it ergot poisoning, mass hysteria, deliberate fraud, social conflict expressing itself through a theological vocabulary, political crisis generating a convenient scapegoat? The answer is probably not any one of these things, but some combination of many of them, operating simultaneously and reinforcing each other in ways that are impossible to fully separate after 3 centuries. What historians agree on is the basic shape of the events and their costs. More than 200 accused, 20 dead, hundreds imprisoned, impoverished, traumatized. A community that took years to begin to recover and generations to fully reckon with what it had done, and in the background of all of it, the ordinary life of colonial New England going on, the planting and the harvesting, the prayers and the sermons, the cold mornings and the long days, the animals and the fires and the thin meals, the families sleeping together in their small, smoky rooms, trying to keep the world together one day at a time. That ordinary life is what makes the Salem story human rather than simply historical. It is easy to think of the past as a kind of theater, events happening at a distance, performed by people who are essentially characters rather than people. The records of Salem push against that tendency. They insist on the specificity of the people involved, on the fact that Rebecca Nurse had a name and a family and a face and a voice that said again and again that she was innocent, that Giles Corey was a real man in a real field on a real September day, and that the weight that killed him was actual weight and that he felt it. History asks us to hold that specificity, to resist the flattening of real people into representative figures, real events into cautionary tales. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale, yes, but they are also, first and most importantly, a story of specific human beings in a specific place at a specific time, doing what human beings do under pressure. Some of them terribly, some of them heroically, most of them somewhere in the complicated middle, trying to survive and make sense of a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. The formal exonerations, when they came, acknowledged that. The Massachusetts legislature's work to clear the names of the condemned has been slow and sometimes incomplete, driven by the advocacy of descendants, historians, and community members who understood that the record needed correcting not as an abstract legal exercise, but because real people had been wrongly destroyed, and their descendants had carried that wrong forward through generations without any official acknowledgement that it had been a wrong. When Elizabeth Johnson Jr. was finally exonerated in 2022, it was a seventh grader from North Andover who spearheaded the legislative effort, a child who had learned about Salem in school and decided that the gap between what had happened and what had been officially acknowledged was intolerable and fixable. She was right on both counts. The gap was intolerable and it was fixable. It just required someone young enough to believe that fixing it was worth the effort and persistent enough to do the work. There is something quietly hopeful in that story, sitting alongside the darkness of the rest. That a wrong done 329 years ago could still be officially corrected. That the descendants of the wrongly accused could still, across those centuries, find their way to a moment of acknowledgement. That the past is not so sealed and finished as it sometimes seems, that it can still be argued with, still responded to, still in some small way amended. Salem is still there. The city, the history, the documents, the memorial benches with their carved names, and somewhere under the rocky hillside that was Gallows Hill, the physical remains of what happened persist in the earth, changed past recognition, returned to the ground, but present. The 20 who died have been part of that place for more than 3 centuries now. Their names are carved in stone, their voices are preserved in documents, their stories are still being told in classrooms and in museums and in books and in quiet evenings to people who need to know that this happened and what it cost. And so, as we let the story of Salem settle softly around us, as the names and the faces and the cold stone rooms begin to grow quieter and more distant. There is one last thing worth holding for a moment before sleep comes. The people of Salem in 1692 were not uniquely wicked or uniquely foolish. They were not fundamentally different from any of us lying here tonight in the dark. They were people under enormous pressure, people living inside a framework of belief that made certain things seem not just possible, but necessary. People caught up in a momentum that none of them individually seemed able to stop. That is perhaps the most sobering truth the Salem story offers us. Not that monsters existed among those people, but that ordinary human beings, operating from genuine fear and genuine belief and genuine community pressure, were capable of this. That a community could arrive at this place without a single individual making a choice that felt to them obviously wrong. The 20 who died were real people: Rebecca Nurse, the elderly church-going woman who protested her innocence until the end; John Proctor, who wrote the letter no one acted on in time; Mary Easty, who asked not for her own life but for protection for those who would come after; Giles Corey, 80 years old, in a field outside Salem town, who simply would not give the court what it wanted. They were real. They had mornings and evenings and cold winters and ordinary days and people who loved them. And they are gone because a community was afraid and could not find its way out of that fear fast enough. Perhaps as you lie here now, in your warm bed, in your quiet room, in whatever corner of the world you've settled into tonight, you can feel the weight of how far we have come from that cold hill in 1692. And perhaps something in the distance between then and now feels, just for this moment, like a quiet kind of relief. The dark outside your window tonight is just the dark. There is nothing in it that means you harm. Your neighbors are sleeping the same way you are. The morning will come with the same steady certainty it always does. And whatever pressures and fears and uncertainties you carry into this night, you don't have to carry them right now. Just let the words drift softer now, like smoke rising in a dark room, like the last light fading from a cold Massachusetts sky in the autumn of a year a very long time ago. Let the names rest. Let the dates rest. Let the fear that made Salem what it was rest too, somewhere far behind you, fading with every slow breath you take. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight except the quiet. If sleep has already begun to take you, let it. If your thoughts are drifting and growing hazy at the edges, let them drift. That is exactly what this is for. The story will continue softly in the background while your body grows heavier and your breathing slows, and the long day behind you finally, gently lets go. Thank you for spending this quiet evening with Drowsy History. Wherever you are, whatever time the clock says, I hope the words have carried you somewhere a little softer than where the day began. Drop a comment when you wake, just to let me know where you drifted off. By the fire, or somewhere in the fields, or in the dark outside a small house in a frightened village a very long time ago. Until the next quiet evening, rest well, breathe slowly, and let sleep come exactly as it should.